Week 5, Lesson 6, Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency. In 1953, the American government formed a subcommittee on juvenile delinquency to figure out why young children, especially boys, were becoming more aggressive and breaking the law. This subcommittee didn't start out targeting comics, but with the controversy of comics being a new medium which was selling unorthodox material like violence, horror, and crime, comics became an easy scapegoat to blame for juvenile delinquency. In April 21st, 22nd, and on June 6 of 1954, public hearings took place regarding the dangers held by comics. These hearings were televised live. For the sake of time, we're going to focus on the first of the three public hearings. While the other hearings are worth looking at and bringing up some important points about comics, the testimony by Frederick Wortham and William Bill Gaines are the most influential ones of the hearing, and get to the point about what the hearings were really about. The first experts up were anti-comics, and the council gave them no scrutiny. They were allowed to point out every problem that they had with comics, even though they didn't have any data to actually show that comics were having a negative effect on children. There were a few pro-comic experts that wanted to speak, but were denied the chance. The experts that did show up in defense of comics were dismissed as paid apologists. Frederick Wortham's findings were brought up in the hearings, and eventually Wortham himself was brought up to testify. His testimony was in 4 parts. First, he classified them. Second, he sees if they're harmful. Third, he sees how widespread their harm is. And fourth, he suggests how to fix them. For the second, he's quoted as saying, "Are there any bad effects of comic books? I may say on this subject, there is practically no controversy." He claims that he discovered the negative results of comics by doing his own studies, but fails to give any raw data or statistics to back up his claim. He makes it clear that he doesn't think comic book artists are evil, and he's on record as saying, "Let me tell you, among the writers and among the cartoonists, they don't love me. But I know many of them are decent people and would much rather be doing something else than what they are doing." He claims the Superman complex is harmful to children's development. The Superman complex are fantasies of sadistic joy in seeing other people punished over and over again while you yourself remain immune. In these comic books, the crime is always real and Superman's triumph over good is unreal. Moreover, these books, like any other, teach complete contempt for the police. So, Lex Luthor using a magic ring to give himself super strength, and an old balding man transferring his brain into an actress so that he can use atomic explosions to threaten cities are completely realistic according to Wortham. Either that, or he's picking and choosing what he read, or didn't even read that many Superman comic books. He goes on to say that groups tried to label him a communist because he was fighting against comics. He also used a quote, "I think Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry. They get children much younger. They teach them race hatred at the age of 4 before they can read." A quote that I'm sure all the Jewish creators in the industry did not appreciate. He used an example of a comic book story of some immigrants moving to the States and getting beaten to death, but he could not recall the name of that comic book when asked. His testimony seemed pretty damning, but if the council wanted to have a non-biased hearing, it could have ripped his case apart. His lack of actual evidence should have hurt his credibility, but because he had the title of doctor and wrote a book demonizing comics, the council was lenient on him, unlike the man who followed Wortham's testimony. The next man up was EC Comics owner William Bill Gaines. Bill Gaines had an issue with bullies. His dad was a bully. He didn't approve of the subcommittee targeting comics, and he wasn't pleased that Wortham, who he knew was speaking, was singling out his comic books. So, when all the other comic book writers, artists, and editors were keeping their heads down, staying out of the spotlight, Gaines decided that he'd tackle the subcommittee head-on. I think it's safe to say that Mr. Gaines did not know what he was getting himself into. He took credit for starting the horror comics trend in America, and is quoted as saying,
"I publish many comic magazines in addition to picture stories from the Bible. For example, I publish horror comics. I was the first publisher in these United States to publish horror comics. I'm responsible. I started them. Some may not like them. That's a matter of personal taste. It would be just as difficult to explain the harmless thrill of a horror story to a Dr. Wortham as it would be to explain the sublimity of love to a frigid old maid. Because of this, I might point out that we have the highest sales in independent distribution. I don't mean highest sales in comparison to comics of another type. I mean highest sales in comparison to other horror comics. The magazine is one of the few remaining, the comic magazine is one of the few remaining pleasures that a person may buy for a dime today. Pleasure is what we sell. Entertainment, reading enjoyment. Entertaining reading has never harmed anyone. Men of goodwill, free men, should be ever grateful for one sentence in the statement made by Federal Judge John M. Woolsey when he lifted the ban on Ulysses. Judge Woolsey said, "It is only with the normal person that the law is concerned."
He claimed that any child or adult would find worse examples of violence in newspapers, and if you banned the retelling of violent crimes in comics, then you'd have to ban them in newspapers too. The judges responded by describing an EC Comics story where a kid is adopted, turned into a werewolf, and kills his parents. He replied with,
No message has been spelled out there. We were not trying to prove anything with that story. None of the captions said anything like, if you're unhappy with your stepmother, shoot her.
The subcommittee accuses Gaines' story of potentially causing orphans anxiety issues with being associated with werewolves. Gaines then tries to explain to the subcommittee that there's no such things as werewolves or vampires. The subcommittee counters by bringing up an EC story where a little girl gets her parents murdered. They just show the last page of the story. Gaines then tries to explain that this is a twist ending, and it's clear that the subcommittee isn't sure what a twist ending is, and hasn't had much exposure to them. When Gaines asks to show the entire story and not just the last page presented, his request is refused. Seemingly disgusted, one of the subcommittee's members asks,
Is the sole test of what you would put into a magazine whether it sells? Is there any limits that you think of that you wouldn't put into a magazine because you thought a child shouldn't see or read about it?
No, I wouldn't say that there is any limit for the reason you outlined. My only limits are the bounds of good taste, what I consider good taste.
So you think that a child cannot in any way, shape, or manner be hurt by anything that the child reads or sees?
I do not believe so, sir.
In other words, there would be no limit actually to what you put into your magazine.
Only within the bounds of good taste.
Your own good taste and saleability.
Just please, in that connection,
Senator Chief Walker.
I've just been looking over some of these. Here seems to be your May 22nd issue, and here seems to be a man with a bloody axe holding a woman's head up, which has been severed from her body. Do you think that's in good taste?
The subcommittee then shows the cover of Crime Suspense Stories, issue number 22.
Yes, sir, I do. For the cover of a horror comic. A cover in bad taste, for example, might be defined as holding the head a little higher so that the neck could be seen dripping from it, and moving the body over a little further so that the neck of the body could be seen to be bloody.
Well, you've got blood coming out of her mouth, you see.
A little.
Then here's blood on the axe, the hatchet. And I think most adults are shocked by that. And here's another one.
Another one. I want you to show him that one.
This is the July one. Seems to be a man with a woman in the boat, and he's choking her to death here.
With a crowbar.
With a crowbar. Is that in good taste, you think?
The subcommittee then shows the Crime Suspense Stories, issue number 23 cover.
I think so.
How could it be worse?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I don't, if the
Senator Missouri.
council will bear with me, I don't think that it's really the function of our committee to argue with this gentleman. I believe that he has given us about the sum and substance of his philosophy, but I would like to ask you one question, sir.
You may proceed.
You have indicated by what, I hope you forgive me if I suggest, seemed a bit of self-righteousness, to suggest that your motivation was bringing enjoyment. Is that the word you used?
Yes, sir.
To the readers of these publications. You don't mean to dissociate the profit motive
Certainly not.
entirely, do you?
Certainly not, although
Without asking you to delineate as between the two, we might say that there is a combination of both, might we not?
oh, no question
Yes.
about it.
Is there anything else that you would like to say to us with respect to your business and matters that we're inquiring into?
I don't believe so.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask just one or two questions.
You may proceed, Senator.
Mr. Gaines, I'd heard that your father had he really didn't have horror and crime comics. When he had the business, he printed things that were really funny and stories of the Bible. But you're the one that started out this crime and horror business, aren't you?
I didn't start crime. I started horror.
Well, who started crime?
I really don't know.
The dialogue goes on after that to talk about the sales of crime and horror comics, and about how they completely outsold Bible comics. And about how Mr. Gaines wrote an editorial saying that the group most anxious to get comics banned were communists. The problem was that this committee was televised, so, to many American parents watching, Gaines looked disinterested in their children's welfare in order to make a buck. It didn't matter if he was making decent rebuttals, his inability to disprove Wortham's claims made him look bad. And remember, comic book creators weren't as visible then as they are today. With Gaines appearing on television for these hearings, he, for a short but significant time, became the face of comics. So, why is the United States Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency so important? Because it points to a time when the federal government responded to the controversy over comics and spotlighted that controversy over television to America. It showed how one-sided the government was against comics and severely damaged the reputation of comics to a point where drastic measures had to be taken. And what were those drastic measures? We'll deal with those next video. Questions to contemplate. How could the United States Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency been less biased against comics? Do you think it was a mistake for William Gaines to show up to the hearing? Would it have been better if no comic book company owners showed?